Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a world where winter never ends, where snow buries the earth for months, and temperatures plummet to bone-cracking lows. Now imagine choosing to live there, alone, for 20 long years. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Jack Whitaker, the man who defied death in the unforgiving wilds of Yellowstone National Park. Jack Whitaker wasn't born a legend. He became one through a decision that would forever redefine what it means to truly live off the grid. In 1999, at the age of 42, Jack walked away from everything: a stable job, the comfort of a heated home, and the noise of modern civilization. He didn't disappear in a fit of madness or rebellion, but rather out of a growing belief that the world he knew had lost its soul. Traffic lights, phone screens, and crowded cities made him feel disconnected from himself and from something more ancient, something raw and real. That something called to him from deep within the heart of Yellowstone National Park. Jack had spent years working as a forest ranger in Montana, and during that time, he fell in love with the untouched wild, especially the majestic, yet brutal winters of Yellowstone. Unlike most, who only visited the park in summer, Jack saw the true character of the land in its most unforgiving season, when snow covered the trees like a white funeral shroud and silence reigned over frozen rivers. He wasn't naive to the dangers. He knew what it meant to live without electricity, running water, or access to emergency services. But he wasn't chasing adventure. He was seeking solitude. With only a backpack of essentials, a hunting rifle, a few tools, and his faithful dog Scout, Jack hiked deep into the forest, away from marked trails and far beyond where tourists ever ventured. He didn't have a clear plan, only a direction, and a belief that human beings were never meant to live entirely removed from nature. That year, as most Americans were preparing for the turn of the millennium, Jack stepped out of time altogether. He entered a world ruled not by clocks and schedules, but by sunrises, animal migrations, and the slow, heavy rhythm of snowfall. This wasn't a weekend experiment or some YouTube wilderness challenge. Jack didn't just survive a night or two in the cold. He made Yellowstone, frozen, fierce, and alive, his permanent home. The winters in Yellowstone are not just cold, they're merciless. They test the limits of endurance, freeze even the sturdiest equipment, and silence all but the hardiest creatures. For Jack Whitaker, surviving these winters wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about mastering the brutal language of cold, isolation, and constant threat. From late October to early May, Jack entered a world few humans ever witness, one dominated by deep snowdrifts, frozen lakes, and winds sharp enough to cut through layers of wool and fur. Temperatures would routinely fall below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and during the darkest stretches of January and February, they plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. Days would pass without sunlight, with only a pale gray twilight illuminating the endless sea of white. At night, the temperature drop was so sudden and intense that his beard would freeze while he slept, and ice would form on the inside of his cabin windows. Keeping a fire alive wasn't optional. It was life or death. Jack had to chop and stack cords of firewood during the brief summer months just to make it through. Even then, he often had to brave snowstorms to gather more, knowing that a single night without heat could end him. He insulated his small log cabin with mud, moss, and snow itself, using the thick, frozen layers as a natural barrier against the cold. His bed was a pile of pine boughs and animal hides, elevated just enough from the ground to keep away the frost that crept up through the floor. Outside, blizzards could last for days, sometimes burying his entire shelter under feet of snow. Venturing out was dangerous, but staying in too long meant risking suffocation if the snow blocked his chimney or oxygen flow. Jack had to constantly monitor the structure, dig out the door, and ensure fresh air could reach inside. There was no electricity, no thermostat to adjust, Only his instincts and sheer willpower stood between him and the silent, frozen death that surrounded him. The cold affected more than just his body, it wore down his mind. The kind of cold that cracks trees and silences birds also creeps into the soul, whispering doubts and fears. Jack had to stay mentally alert, keep his hands moving, his thoughts clear, and his spirit unbroken. Every winter brought new challenges: early snowfalls, unexpected ice storms, and the occasional collapse of a roof under heavy snow. Yet year after year, he adapted, learning to read subtle shifts in the wind, feel the temperature drop in his bones, and prepare for storms before the skies gave warning. Before Jack could dream of surviving Yellowstone's ruthless winters, he needed shelter, something sturdy, insulated, and capable of withstanding months of heavy snow, bitter winds, and the constant threat of predators. He didn't bring a prefabricated cabin kit, nor did he rely on modern construction equipment. Instead, he turned to the most ancient and reliable method known to man: building with his hands, one log at a time. Armed with only an old axe, a handsaw, a draw knife, and a few steel nails passed down from his grandfather's shed, Jack ventured deep into the forest to find the perfect location. He chose a hidden spot near a frozen creek, tucked between thick groves of pine and spruce trees. This provided both cover from the wind and a sustainable source of building material. It was far enough from popular trails to remain unnoticed, but close enough to wildlife paths to ensure access to hunting grounds. Felling trees in sub-zero temperatures is no easy task. The cold hardens the wood, and each swing of the axe echoed through the frozen silence like a drumbeat of determination. Jack would spend entire days dragging logs through the snow, stripping them of bark, and notching them carefully to fit snugly together. He followed the traditional Scandinavian saddle notch method: no frills, no shortcuts, because he knew it was one of the most durable ways to construct a log home without mortar or cement. The cabin took weeks to complete. It measured only about 12 by 14 feet, just large enough to sleep, store food, and keep a fire burning. The roof was a masterpiece of ingenuity. Jack layered pine branches, bark, and packed snow to create natural insulation. When spring came, he replaced the snow layers with mud and moss, which hardened like clay and sealed the roof from rain. A small chimney, crafted from stacked stones and lined with clay, rose from the center, allowing smoke to escape from his wood-burning stove, which he crafted using scrap iron and rocks. The floor was earthen at first, but Jack later elevated it using flattened planks and covered it with fur, hides, and blankets he stitched from old canvas. Inside the cabin, every object served a purpose. Hooks were carved into the walls for hanging tools and drying meat. A single window, just a small square, was cut into the south-facing wall to let in as much weak winter sunlight as possible. This cabin wasn't just a shelter. It became Jack's fortress, his sanctuary, and the only line between life and death during Yellowstone's unforgiving winters. It stood resilient against howling blizzards, torrential snow, and wild animals. And most remarkably, it stood for 2 decades, as strong and quiet as the man who built it with nothing but his hands, patience, and an iron will. In the wilderness of Yellowstone, grocery stores don't exist, and canned goods don't restock themselves. For Jack Whitaker, every meal had to be earned through effort, skill, and patience. From the moment he stepped into the wild, he knew that food wouldn't be a convenience. It would be a constant pursuit, shaped by the seasons, dictated by the land, and never guaranteed. Jack didn't rely on large-scale survivalist gear or stockpiles of rations. His tools were few: a well-worn hunting rifle, a bow he carved himself, a set of handmade traps, and knowledge handed down from generations of frontiersmen and indigenous wisdom. Every bite of food was the result of a decision: a trail tracked, a movement observed, a shot timed with perfect stillness. During the warmer months, he hunted elk, deer, and occasionally bison that wandered far from the plains. Elk were his primary source of meat and fat, but bringing one down wasn't simple. Jack would study their migration paths, sometimes waiting in the same spot for hours without moving, camouflaged in snow-dusted pine branches. When he finally took a shot, he did so with reverence, never wasting a single part of the animal. The meat was preserved by smoking it over slow-burning fires or freezing it naturally in the sub-zero air. Bones were carved into tools, and sinew was dried to use as thread or bindings. In spring and summer, he turned to the rivers and lakes. Yellowstone's waters are teeming with trout and grayling, but catching them without modern gear required both creativity and patience. Jack crafted fish traps from woven branches and sometimes used hand lines made from animal tendons. On quiet mornings, he would sit silently at the water's edge, casting baited hooks beneath the surface, hoping for a catch that would sustain him through the next storm. Rabbits and squirrels were trapped using snares he built by hand, simple loops placed along well-worn animal paths. These smaller creatures were often the difference between hunger and survival when larger game proved elusive. He also set deadfall traps and baited them with berries, bark, or bits of salted meat. In the harshest winters, when game was scarce and the snow made movement nearly impossible, Jack rationed carefully. He turned to his preserved stores, smoked meat, dried fish, and jerky that he had prepared during the brief summer window. He also harvested pine nuts, wild berries, and edible roots when available, though plant-based sustenance was rare in the frozen months. Every meal was a product of effort, every morsel a reminder that survival depended on respect for the land and a deep understanding of the ecosystem. Jack didn't just eat to live. He became a part of the natural cycle, a quiet predator who took only what he needed and gave back by never wasting a single scrap. In the wilderness, water is more precious than gold. Without a clean, consistent supply, even the most experienced survivalist will succumb to dehydration, illness, or worse. For Jack Whitaker, living in Yellowstone's frozen expanse meant that rivers and lakes were often inaccessible for most of the year, hidden beneath thick layers of ice or buried in snowdrifts taller than a man. But where others saw an obstacle, Jack saw a resource: snow itself. Each morning, Jack would gather fresh, clean snow, only the topmost layers, untouched by animals or debris, and bring it inside his cabin in buckets carved from hollowed logs. He learned early on that eating snow directly could be deadly. It lowers the body temperature rapidly, sapping energy needed to stay warm. So, instead, he melted it slowly over his wood-burning stove, a process that required both patience and careful monitoring. Too much heat, and the container would scorch or crack. Too little, and the snow would refreeze before becoming usable. But melted snow wasn't automatically safe to drink. Even in the pristine wilderness of Yellowstone, microscopic bacteria and particles from decaying matter or animal droppings could make their way into the snowpack. Jack had seen fellow rangers fall ill from untreated water during his Forest Service days, so he developed a filtration system, simple, effective, and entirely built from the earth. Using 2 large containers, he built a layered filter, coarse sand at the bottom, then a layer of fine gravel, and finally crushed charcoal made from burnt hardwood. The charcoal absorbed impurities and removed odors, while the sand and gravel trapped sediment and larger contaminants. Water was poured slowly through this system, dripping into a clean vessel below. It was a slow process, yielding only a few cups an hour, but in the wild, every drop mattered. On days when snow was unavailable or heavy storms threatened to contaminate surface layers, Jack would collect rain or ice melt from tree hollows and depressions in rock. He stored water in hollowed stumps lined with animal hide, or occasionally, in containers he crafted from boiled birch bark sealed with pine resin. This system became part of his daily routine. Before sunrise and after sunset, you could find Jack hunched over his fire, carefully melting snow, stirring the pot like a monk at a sacred altar. He once wrote in his journal, "The world is mostly water, but it's not yours until you earn it." And in Yellowstone's endless winter, he earned every sip. The wilderness of Yellowstone isn't just a place of snow and silence. It's a living, breathing realm of predators. Out here, Jack Whitaker wasn't the apex species. He was just another creature surviving in a territory ruled by instinct, hunger, and hierarchy. And for 2 decades, he lived shoulder to shoulder with some of North America's most fearsome animals. Wolves with eyes like ice, grizzlies that could shatter bone with a single swipe, and mountain lions that stalked like shadows between the trees. Jack didn't carry fear in his pocket, but he did carry respect. He knew this land belonged to them long before he arrived, and he didn't pretend to dominate it. He didn't build tall fences or lay traps for protection. He relied on awareness, deep knowledge of animal behavior, and an unshakable calm that came from years of observation and experience. One of his earliest and closest calls came in his third winter, when a pack of wolves trailed him for nearly 3 days. He had been hunting elk and left a trail of blood in the snow from a successful kill. The wolves, curious and opportunistic, followed the scent. 5 of them, sleek and silent, appearing at the edges of the trees just after dusk. Jack didn't panic. He made no sudden moves, lit a large fire, and deliberately placed the elk meat high in a tree to remove temptation. That night, he sat awake with his rifle across his lap, not out of aggression, but as a last resort. By morning, the wolves had moved on, leaving only paw prints and a low, echoing howl in the wind. Grizzlies were different. They were more unpredictable, more powerful, and far less afraid of humans. During warmer months, Jack would hang his food from branches and cook far from his cabin, ensuring no scent lingered to draw them in. But even with such precautions, he had several run-ins, once coming face to face with a mother bear and her 2 cubs while gathering water. He didn't run. He lowered his eyes, raised his hands slowly, and backed away without a word. She watched him, sniffed the air, and eventually turned back toward the forest. Moments like that weren't just close calls. They were life's razor edge. Mountain lions were perhaps the most elusive and unnerving. You rarely see them before they strike. But Jack could feel when one was near. The forest would fall unnaturally silent. Birds would vanish, and that ancient predator's presence would hang heavy, like fog. He carried a carved walking stick sharpened at the end and smeared with pine sap, lightweight, but deadly if needed. But more than weapons, it was his stillness that saved him. Predators respect confidence. Jack never ran, never screamed, and never showed panic. He developed a sixth sense, an internal radar that pulsed when something wild was watching him. And over time, the animals seemed to recognize him, not as prey, not as a threat, but as another being who had earned his place in the vast, unforgiving wild. In the depths of Yellowstone's winter, survival doesn't just depend on food or fire. It hinges on what clings to your skin. The cold is a relentless predator, slipping through cotton, freezing damp wool, and biting through synthetic layers not made for this kind of punishment. Jack Whitaker learned early that ordinary clothes wouldn't keep him alive in temperatures that could turn breath into ice and skin into stone. So he turned to the most time-tested form of insulation known to humankind, the animals themselves. Every garment Jack wore was a product of necessity and craftsmanship. When he hunted elk or deer, he didn't see them as just food. He saw shelter. He would skin them with precision, preserving the hide in as large a piece as possible. The process of tanning the hides was long and brutal on the hands, but essential. Using traditional brain tanning techniques, where the animal's own brain is mashed and applied to the hide to soften and preserve it, Jack created supple, durable leather that could withstand the elements. His clothing wasn't tailored for fashion, but for survival. He stitched heavy elk hide into thick trousers, lined with rabbit fur on the inside for extra insulation. His boots were crafted from moose hide, layered with inner wool from old blankets, and wrapped in leather cords for lacing. He made gloves that stretched past the wrist, insulated with beaver fur he had trapped in the early years, and a thick, hooded coat made from coyote and fox pelts sewn together with sinew thread. Sinew, tendons stripped from animals and dried, became his lifeline for sewing. It was stronger than thread, flexible when damp, and gripped hide tightly when it dried. He sharpened bone needles by hand, using them to punch holes through thick leather, pulling the sinew through inch by inch, stitch by patient stitch. Every piece of clothing was the result of hours of work, and each piece was unique, marked by the shape of the animal it came from and the scars of Jack's labor. But perhaps the most iconic piece of his gear was his fur cloak, a patchwork of wolf, elk, and bear fur that he wore during the worst blizzards. It was heavy, weighing nearly 30 pounds, but it was impenetrable. With it wrapped around his shoulders and his hood pulled low, Jack became part of the wilderness itself, an indistinguishable figure moving through the trees, more beast than man. He even crafted snowshoes from ash wood and rawhide, allowing him to move through deep powder without sinking, and his winter gear was layered in such a way that it trapped heat between animal hide, fur, and his own body. These garments weren't luxuries, they were armor. They held in warmth, repelled snow, and shielded him from the wind that screamed like a banshee through the valleys. Every winter, he would repair what the cold had worn down, restitching seams, patching holes, replacing fur linings. It was a continuous cycle of creation and preservation, a tradition as old as the land itself. In an era where others depended on brands and modern fabrics, Jack relied on what he could trap, tan, and tailor by firelight, using nothing more than instinct, ancestral methods, and his unbreakable will. While most people might see survival as simply enduring the day-to-day, Jack Whitaker approached it with the precision of a scientist and the dedication of a historian. In the isolation of Yellowstone's wilderness, where time and space seemed to stretch endlessly, Jack's ability to track and record the patterns of the land became as important as his ability to hunt or build shelter. He knew that in this vast and unpredictable environment, understanding the rhythm of the earth could mean the difference between life and death. From the moment he set foot in Yellowstone, Jack began recording everything. No detail was too small. Every morning, as the first light broke over the snow-capped peaks, he would sit at his hand-carved wooden table, surrounded by the scent of burning pine and the soft crackle of embers. With a small pencil made from charred wood and a collection of leather-bound journals, he started writing. He meticulously noted the weather, whether the winds had shifted to the northeast, how thick the ice was on the rivers, and whether the snow was dry or wet. These observations didn't just make up the fabric of his daily life. They were the foundation of his survival strategy. Over time, Jack developed a near-encyclopedic knowledge of Yellowstone's weather patterns. He could predict when the first snow of winter would fall based on the angle of the sun and the behavior of local wildlife. He learned to read the sky for subtle signs, a particular cloud formation that hinted at a coming blizzard, or the way the stars glittered on cold nights, signaling a clear, frigid morning. He even made note of the first frost, using it as a marker to gauge the start of the most dangerous part of the year. But weather wasn't the only thing Jack studied closely. He developed a deep understanding of animal movements, which was essential for both hunting and staying safe. He kept detailed logs of where elk, deer, and bison migrated throughout the year, recording the dates they appeared and how their patterns shifted depending on food availability and temperature changes. The wolves, bears, and mountain lions that roamed the area were more unpredictable, but Jack began to recognize their trails, their feeding habits, and the time of day they were most active. By following their tracks, he could predict their movements and avoid dangerous encounters, or, when necessary, track them for food. Jack even studied the smaller creatures that shared the land, rabbits, squirrels, and birds. Their behavior was just as crucial, as they could often signal larger predators' presence or the change of seasons. He made note of when the migratory birds began to leave and the types of berries the bears were eating to fatten up for hibernation. Every piece of the ecosystem, no matter how small, was interconnected, and Jack's keen eye for detail allowed him to make sense of it all. By the end of each month, his journals were filled with observations so intricate they could rival the most dedicated naturalist's field notes. He didn't just record the weather. He recorded its impact, how a heavy snowstorm delayed the elk migration or how the long winter affected the reproductive cycles of certain animals. These records were a lifeline, allowing him to plan his next move, anticipate dangers, and ensure that he was always one step ahead of the wilderness. The journals also served as a form of mental preservation. The isolation of Yellowstone could drive a person mad, but Jack found solace in his written words. He could revisit them on quiet evenings, reflecting on his progress and the changes he had witnessed in the land over the years. His writing wasn't just a record of survival. It was a testament to his resilience, his connection to the land, and his unyielding determination to remain in harmony with the forces of nature around him. In the heart of Yellowstone, where the winds howl through the pines and the snow blankets the earth in endless white, Jack Whitaker faced a challenge that most would find unbearable: the intense, unbroken isolation of life in the wilderness. For years, he lived without human companionship, cut off from the world he once knew. The nearest town was hundreds of miles away, and the only sound for weeks on end might be the whisper of the wind or the crack of ice forming in the cold. For many, this kind of solitude would break the spirit, twist the mind, and fuel a longing to return to civilization. But Jack Whitaker was not like most people. While others might have felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on them, Jack found a profound peace in the quiet isolation of Yellowstone. He learned to embrace it, to listen to the rhythm of the land, and to find solace in the sound of his own heartbeat. At first, the silence had been unsettling. In the early months, when the wind would whip through the trees and the snowstorm would blur the landscape, he would hear his own voice echo back at him when he spoke aloud, something he did infrequently, but sometimes needed to remind himself he was still human. But over time, Jack adapted. He began to perceive the wilderness not as a vast emptiness, but as a living, breathing entity. Every step he took was accompanied by the gentle whisper of the trees, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, and the occasional, distant call of an animal. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet pulse that became a source of comfort, a natural symphony in which Jack was an instrument. He found companionship in the animals of the land, and through their eyes, he came to understand the true meaning of coexistence. The wolves that circled in the distance, the solitary grizzlies that lumbered through the forest, the mountain lions that crept silently through the trees. Each creature was a part of the same unspoken dialogue between life and death. Jack often found himself studying them, not just for survival purposes, but out of a deep, instinctive connection. He understood their patterns, their movements, and their needs. In a way, he had become a part of their world, and they, in turn, had become a part of his. Jack also discovered that the isolation allowed him to focus on what truly mattered. Without the distractions of society, no bustling streets, no conversations, no noise of modern life. He had the time and the space to listen to his thoughts, reflect on his past, and plan for the future. He spent long hours thinking, not about his isolation, but about the intricate patterns of the wilderness that surrounded him. The way the trees grew in certain areas, the path the river carved through the land, the way the wind shifted in the autumn. These were the things that preoccupied his mind. The rest of the world, with its human noise and chaos, seemed distant and irrelevant. The solitude also offered him the chance to learn from the land itself. Without the noise of human society, he could hear the deeper voice of nature, The rustling of the leaves, the subtle changes in the air as a storm approached, and the way the animals moved through the landscape. His every sense became finely tuned to the smallest shifts in the environment. Jack developed an almost preternatural ability to read the landscape, the shifting of shadows, the crack of a tree branch underfoot, the faintest sound in the distance. These were the subtle signs that told him when a storm was coming, when a predator was near, or when the land would be fruitful with game. In the evenings, after the work was done and the fire crackled low in his cabin, Jack would sit quietly by the hearth, savoring the stillness. He didn't need music, entertainment, or company. The silence had become his companion, and in it, he had found peace. The hours that would have once felt interminable stretched out like a canvas for his thoughts. He would often reflect on the people he had known, the world he had left behind, and the life he had built in the wilderness. The solitude, once foreign and daunting, had become a part of him. Jack didn't need anyone else to validate his existence. The land, with all its beauty and danger, provided everything he needed. In embracing the isolation, he had discovered a deeper connection to the natural world than most would ever experience. He had become a part of the landscape itself, silent, enduring, and eternally bound to the wilderness he had learned to call home. Surviving 20 years in the unforgiving winter of Yellowstone wasn't the product of sheer endurance alone. It was the result of Jack Whitaker's profound ability to adapt, his unparalleled resourcefulness, and his unyielding commitment to learn from the environment around him. The wilderness does not suffer fools or stagnation. Those who survive in such a hostile place must constantly evolve, think creatively, and, above all, remain humble enough to acknowledge that nature always has something new to teach. One of Jack's greatest strengths was his relentless adaptability. Every season brought a new set of challenges, each one different from the last, with its own dangers and demands. The heavy snows of winter could bury entire sections of his cabin, making it impossible to leave or gather firewood. In the spring, the thaw brought swelling rivers that turned the ground beneath his feet into treacherous mud, yet the melting snow also provided water that was vital for his survival. In summer, the warmth could bring an influx of wildlife, elk, bison, and predators like bears, that could overwhelm his small refuge. Jack didn't simply weather these changes. He learned from them, adjusted his strategies, and used them to his advantage. For instance, when he first arrived, Jack struggled with the harsh winters and extreme temperatures, unaware of the best ways to insulate his shelter. His first attempt at a cabin had been inadequate, and during his first winter, the walls would freeze solid despite his efforts. He quickly adapted by learning the art of constructing a sturdier, more efficient structure. He used logs for insulation, packing earth and moss between the layers to keep out the wind and cold. By the following winter, his cabin was a fortress, warm and impenetrable, and he was able to ride out the worst storms in relative comfort. Jack's resourcefulness came into play in every aspect of his daily life. From crafting tools and weapons to making every piece of gear from scratch, he relied on what the land provided. He knew how to break down a tree into usable firewood, how to weave twine from plant fibers, and how to forge hunting tools from bone and stone. He had no storehouses of supplies, no pre-made materials to fall back on. Every piece of clothing, every tool, and every shelter was a product of his ingenuity. When Jack encountered obstacles, whether it was a failed hunt, a storm that threatened to wipe out his provisions, or an unexpected injury, he responded with a calm, practical mindset. He never panicked. His first instinct was always to assess the situation, identify what he had at his disposal, and develop a plan. In one instance, when his rifle became clogged with mud and rendered useless, Jack did not surrender to the thought of starvation. Instead, he began to experiment with primitive traps, building snares from rope and using bones to create rudimentary fishing spears. He made the decision to focus on what was available to him instead of lamenting what he lacked. This constant process of self-sufficiency helped him survive the harshest conditions year after year. Learning from the environment was a cornerstone of Jack's success. He didn't view nature as a hostile force to be fought against. Instead, he respected it, studied it, and adapted his behaviors to it. For example, he observed how animals reacted to changing seasons, how certain predators would grow more active before a storm, or how migratory birds signaled an impending frost. By understanding the cycles of nature, he was able to predict what might happen next and act accordingly. His ability to read the land and the animals around him was an invaluable skill, one that allowed him to stay one step ahead of the unpredictable wilderness. Jack also honed his understanding of the delicate balance between human survival and the sustainability of the ecosystem. He never overhunted or overgathered. He learned when to take and when to leave, ensuring that the land would continue to provide for him year after year. By observing the habits of animals and plants, he understood the delicate web of life that supported his own. He never harvested more than he needed and always left behind enough for the ecosystem to replenish itself. This deep respect for the environment allowed him to live in harmony with it, a rare achievement in a world where human beings often try to conquer nature rather than coexist with it. This constant learning and adapting were what kept Jack alive, even when the odds were stacked against him. In the end, it wasn't just his physical strength or his will to survive that allowed him to endure. It was his ability to change, to grow, and to listen. He didn't fight against nature. He became a part of it. Through his adaptability, resourcefulness, and willingness to learn, Jack Whitaker lived for 2 decades in one of the harshest environments on Earth, not as an outsider, but as a quiet, enduring figure blending seamlessly into the wilderness. Jack Whitaker's remarkable journey in Yellowstone stands as a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and respect for the natural world. For 20 years, he survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, not merely by enduring the wilderness, but by embracing it and learning from it. He transformed isolation into strength, solitude into wisdom, and hardship into a way of life that others might deem impossible. His story reminds us that survival is not just about brute strength or overcoming obstacles through sheer force. It's about understanding, adapting, and working in harmony with the world around us. Jack's time in Yellowstone was a profound lesson in the power of self-reliance and the deep, intricate relationship we can form with nature when we take the time to truly listen to it. In a world increasingly detached from the natural environment, Jack Whitaker's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons are found not in the rush of civilization, but in the quiet, enduring wilderness, where survival is not guaranteed, but earned through patience, respect, and unwavering determination. Jack's legacy, however silent it may be in the vastness of the wilderness, lives on. It lives in the stillness of the mountains, the echo of the wolves, and the whispers of the wind. And perhaps most of all, it lives in the hearts of those who still look to the wild with wonder and reverence, just as Jack Whitaker once did.